All right. So today, thank you for attending the Grief and Loss During a Global Pandemic. This webinar will be presented by myself, Dr. Sarmiento, and my colleague.
Yes, hi, my name is Darnell Smith.
All right, so let's get started. So for this webinar today, what we will be discussing is these key points right here, which is identifying how to meet the needs of others who are coping with grief, and that includes experiencing losses during the current pandemic, identifying ways to take care of yourself in the middle of the crises, how to normalize and validate the impact of grief while also helping others, and then what to say and what not to say to someone who's grieving, and how to prepare for the losses of loved ones to the virus or deaths during this pandemic. So currently we are experiencing a new world. So what that looks like is we have COVID worldwide, and we're constantly being flooded with images nonstop. Our communities are sheltering at home still, and we're waiting for the lift orders to be put in place. So some are very fearful for what's to come, and we're working from home or from closed offices. Our environment and our workspaces have changed, and therefore our technology has changed. We're now doing virtual meetings more frequently, and businesses are also struggling to keep open or maintain. So those are just some of the things that we're dealing with. And then on top of that, we have people in positions that are considered essential workers, and they're continuing to risk their lives daily to keep the economy going as well. And we do have fears for our own families, and we're fearful or we've lost either our peers or possibly family members in this pandemic. Students are experiencing an increase in anxiety and also from multiple losses, and some of these losses we'll identify later. So we're watching to see what's coming our way, and for now and also in the future, and we're adapting to life without certainty. So there's a lot that's kind of going on that's making it kind of hard to adapt or really know what to expect. So emotional trauma. So quickly, I'll talk about the experience of constant streaming trauma on social media today. So what that looks like is the racial trauma, as well as just the political stuff that's kind of up, and we see a lot of what's going on and what that can be considered as trauma because we're constantly being exposed to it. And it's especially now more prevalent since we are at home. So experiencing losses that are not death related is another loss that we're actually going through. And that's including not understanding what the impact is for the griever, things that are changing rapidly, and there's no time to integrate one loss before another happens. So that's been happening very frequently, especially within the past few months. And then the community is grieving the loss of others, including death or just a loss of different things that we're going through, and there's no place to escape because we are stuck at home. Essentially, support systems deplenished, and that's due to recent guidelines. So being at home and not being able to have that social interaction or connection. So there's several memes about 2020 and how this has been the worst year. And the thing that we really need to think about is how can we work together to improve our current situation? And no one really thought that this was going to be our current reality. And we really need to focus on understanding how to support each other and the people that are in need, and explaining the situation to our youth so that way we can create more adaptive behaviors. So where do we go from here? What are our priorities? Grief online, and then how do we cope and manage at the same time?
So let's look at the big picture. Funerals are ways to say goodbye to your loved ones, and many services are delayed or set up in a non-traditional fashion, and the connection is lost. Multiple families are experiencing rapid death, and those who are sick cannot say goodbye as well. Essential workers being exposed and not being able to remove themselves from the situation for financial and job security reasons. There are many financial stressors and losses of homes, apartments, jobs, security, and retirement savings. Next slide, please. So what is grief and loss? What is grief and loss and how is it defined? Grief is the response to loss to someone or something. It's a bond or affection was formed, conventionally focused on the emotional response to loss. So in addition to emotional loss is grief. Grief can have a physical, cognitive, behavioral, social, cultural, spiritual, and physiological dimension. How individuals cope with loss depends on a variety of factors, including previous life experiences and the support systems that they have around them. Next slide, please. So we have stages of grief, which look like shock, emotional release, depression, physical symptoms of distress, anxiety, hostility, guilt, hesitancy to renew normal activities, healing of memories, acceptance of one's new role in life. And for something like shock, the initial stage of grief is usually experienced even if the death has been expected in a long-term illness. There is only so much physical or psychic pain which can be endured by the mind, and when that limit is reached, the mental emotional system shuts down. When you take a look at emotional release, as shock wears off, there's a need to release all the emotions that have been building up. This release may be verbal or physical, and while this is healthy, care should be taken to ensure the safety of individuals, others, or personal property. When we look at physical symptoms of distress, the grieving individual will often take on the physical symptoms of the illness and that cause the death of the loved one. In the event of an accident, the bereaved will sometimes feel pressure in the chest or have stomach problems and fear heart attack or cancer. This is normal and usually indicates the depth of loss and a person wishing to join the deceased. Next slide, please. So our current unrecognized losses includes graduations, proms, promotions for littles and kinders and sixth graders, not being able to see parents, friends, or extended family. We need to start by naming what the losses are, not only honor them, but make space for them and not compare the losses, because ultimately loss is loss and we all interpret and internalize loss differently. Next slide, please. So adding to this grief process, life has changed with wearing masks, consistent fire breakouts with many families losing their homes, the death of Chadwick Boseman, actor of Black Panther in the Marvel Universe, and the great Kobe Bryant, his daughter Gigi, and 9 others in a plane crash. And now there is a confirmed case of UFOs. We need a break before they touch down. Next slide, please. So that brings me to social distancing. Humans by nature are social creatures and are tasked finding new ways to demonstrate their feelings. Many adults work from home with kids who are in school virtually. And this has created different relationships among families by adding a level of anxiety and stress.
Okay, so what baggage are we bringing with us? So losses unrelated to death, we will need to be named basically to support them. And we need to make sure that people that are feeling down or depressed, that we can name that for them, because that matters. So as discussed previously, these losses can really shake our sense of self. And not only can we be grieving loss of a loved one, but we can also be grieving the sense of safety, as well as social connectedness, and then financial stability or security. These can be considered a living loss, and we can also grieve the way that we've lost with regards to affect and with regards to the way that we perceive ourselves and our personal identity. And we really need to think about what part of who you are is defined by your social interactions. And if we are quarantined at home, what does that mean for you if we're not engaging in those social interactions? And really identifying if we have loss, um, if we identify those losses, if it can help us move forward from there. So, with regards to responding to uncertainty in life and the world that we're trying to manage on our own, and then experiencing losses from death compounded by other losses, there's a lot that we basically have to unpackage or peel apart the layers. And when we are experiencing these losses unrelated to death, and then on top of that, experiencing death within our community, it's really hard right now because of the global pandemic that we're going through, and it's making it harder for us to really cope in an effective way. So the new process of death and grief. So within the therapeutic realm, typically loss from death means that we're helping others understand what they've seen or heard or even have experienced during the dying process, to really be able to begin doing grief work. But there's this new process of death and grief in the sense of our loved ones are starting to die alone. And that's like, for example, in the hospitals. And then we're not being able to say goodbye. So we've seen a lot of social media and just pictures of people dying in a window, or using a cell phone to try to talk to their loved ones, or even on tablets. So this leaves us and our families fearing what they don't know. So not being able to be in the hospital as frequently. And some of these guidelines are being lifted to where we are able to go in the hospitals a little bit more, but it is still very strict guidelines. So this also places a lot of guilt for not being able to be there. So even if we're experiencing having a cold, or we're unsure because we don't feel well, we can't really put ourselves in a place to risk putting others at exposure. So being unable to comfort one another or be together, and then some are even sick themselves, like really not being able to feel like you can fully be there for someone. So COVID deaths resemble the experience of sudden deaths in normal time for families. So there's this feeling of unexpectedness, inability to be either there or present, and then also not able to see the body of your loved ones or really prepare the same way, and then no time to plan, and then the fast decisions that have to be made, and then not a lot of information is given. So there's a lot of unknown, and that can put a lot of stress on families and on the loved ones. So COVID-19 deaths versus others. So losses during this pandemic currently are occurring without the traditional experience that we're used to, and also the traditional support systems. So the typical systems that we've had in place, we're not able to have now. And then previously, at the beginning months of COVID, it was recognized that there was only one inpatient hospice unit for the entire US for COVID. Most hospices were cut with regards to their in-person services to protect their patients. And so looking at the pre-COVID versus post-COVID, things such as pre-COVID, before COVID hit or the guidelines were put in place, we were aware of the illnesses and in the progression and coming death. And with regards to saying goodbyes to our loved one, or really being able to have the opportunity to be there. And then mortuaries weren't afraid of others visiting. And on top of that, there is information available about what to expect and what occurs, and then allowing that time to plan. So with regards to post-COVID, families aren't present. A lot of times, even being able to go out of state or out of country to really come and be there to be a part of what's going on and support family members, that's not necessarily in play. And death can occur very rapidly. With regards to the intubation, that means no talking. So not even being able to say bye to a loved one or hearing their voice. And then some hospitals do not have time for calls or videos. And what that means is there's a new role put in place for nurses and hospital staff to where if they are working with COVID patients, they have on this new role where they have to make sure that they're able to do those calls and videos for their loved ones of the patients. And it really puts a whole nother level of stress and anxiety into the situation with regards to what's going on. So families hear all the chatter about death in the media, so it heightens the stress and makes things more unpredictable. And then we're not as prepared for the diagnosis when we hear about the death and there's very little time in between. So there's no place for our traditional memorials or services. So one example is the VA cemeteries had announced that those that were attending must stay in their cars. So they weren't expecting anybody to return unless they were in twos. So we do have video funerals, drive-in funerals, and for some there hasn't been any funerals. So especially at the beginning of the global pandemic. And services are the way of families that we usually come together and either share the loss or celebrate the memories that are positive, and then really working through that recovery phase. But that's not necessarily what's in play right now currently. So what is it that we really needed to think about? And what that is basically the needs of how to prepare. And so the dying process, the end of life paperwork, and then grief's systemic impact. So funerals, and what is it that we are going to be doing from here.
So what you need to know to help others: correcting their imagined scenarios, helping them understand the dying process and comfort measures, talking through the experience of the dying person as we understand it for research, providing education that would ordinarily be given by hospice or hospital staff about what to expect and would occur, and normalizing it become the grief therapist's job. Knowing at least the minimum about the dying process is essential to helping grievers. Children grieve differently, and they need to hear it more at a biological explanation. Next slide, please. So psychoeducational impact of grief. Families grieve the way they live, and your loved one comes to you after experiencing this. As stated before, grief and loss can take a toll on you physically, emotionally, cognitively, spiritually, and relationships, every part of the griever's life. So we must be prepared to educate about how grief impacts everything. Next slide, please. So we want to encourage some kind of service. Research suggests if a loss is not fully grieved and recovered, the griever remains in grief and is at risk for health issues, marital conflict, and a loss of functioning in work and family. Next slide, please. So what to say and not to say. Here are a couple of examples of what to say and not to say. What not to say. I know just what you're going through. Say this instead. Can you tell me more about what this has been like for you? Here's another example of what not to say. This is hard, but it'll pass, don't worry. Say this instead. What kinds of memories do you have about that person? And another example would be, my dog died last week, so I know what you're going through. Say this instead. I know how I felt when someone I love died, but can you tell me how you've been feeling? Next slide, please. So, tips for grief. You want to create open dialogue. You want to predict, plan, and prepare. Have them have control. Have them help them with coping, rest, and sleep. Providing comfort in a safe space, as well as your full attention. So, an open dialogue, you want to encourage open dialogue about this upcoming year. Ask open-ended questions that allow for thoughtful responses, such as, what are you looking forward to this year? What are some things I can do to help? You want to include discussions about the best way to support them. I know when I'm having a tough day, I like to listen to music in the car or on the way to pick you up. Coping. Coping identities Like coping, identify activities outside of schoolwork that can serve as coping skills. So creatively and imagine a great way to develop a child's coping skill. Encourage them to find or reinvest in activities that they are good at and find interesting. Recreation is vital for the development of attributes that contribute to resiliency and can diversify a student's peer group. And then we have rest and sleep. Research confirms that children who rest more sleep better. An exhausted child does not sleep better. Help the child make space in his or her schedule for downtime and sleep between 8 to 12 hours, depending on the age. A healthy body and mind lead to better management of stress and emotions.
All right, so some facts about grief and loss. So we really need to take time to think about some of the misconceptions that we have with regards to grief and loss within our own society. And it seems like there's this expectancy of everyone to get back to normal right away. So an example of this is when we do request bereavement, typically it's between 4 and 7 days that we're allowed to get, maybe sometimes 4 and 8 days. And that's when we have a loss of a close family member. So we really need to think about, what is that telling us? A lot of times society will tell us that, that's a certain time that we're allowed to grieve, and then we have to get back to work, get back to our normal day-to-day job. But is that really something that is a reality that we can really do? I've even heard it too where someone said before that, hey, why is this person still celebrating their child's birthday? It's been 2 years since they passed away. So we really need to keep in mind that pain can last for an entire lifetime, and it really doesn't go away, but it changes and it shifts. So there's no set time frame for grief, and there are no firm stages of grief for children, especially in the sense of there's stages of grief, but it doesn't mean that you'll be set in one. There's a lot of fluidity between what it is you're experiencing. So keep in mind that a child may be misbehaving or acting out, but in actuality, they're experiencing grief or they're experiencing some form of loss. So transitions and changes in life, such as winter break, can be difficult and may remind the child or even an adult of the loss. So divorce, separation, incarceration of a parent, these are also considered losses that we really don't think about. And then memories of trauma, such as domestic violence, witness to a crime, physical or sexual abuse, can also be triggers during the holidays. So warning signs in teens. Our children and teens may be struggling and showing signs of grief and loss, but it's in a different way compared to what we're used to seeing. So there are some warning signs that we should look out for. So the first one, withdrawal, it's more like spending more time in their room or isolating kind of by themselves. Struggling to get out of bed, even logging into virtual school or class. Becoming numb or apathetic about things that they ordinarily love, or seem more on edge and argue or seem angry. Keeping in mind that they are experiencing the loss of those relationships that they've built and felt and experienced as well. So it makes things harder. If there's a sudden drop in grades, struggle to engage in or concentrate on homework. They send sad memes or engage in darker content on the social media. They talk hopelessly about the future. If they appear on edge or often, for example, rubbing their legs, eyes darting around, struggling to sit still. And then on top of that, another thing that can be a warning sign would be that they feel like they're misunderstood or alone. So falling out or distracting, just distancing from people that they are typically close to is another thing of pushing people away when they feel like they're going through something as well. That can be an indicator. If they're either eating a lot or not eating enough, and then if they're always appearing tired, like they're just going through the motions as well. So I know that's something that's been happening a lot lately, especially with students currently with virtual school as well. They are just kind of going through the motions, and it begins to feel like it's wearing on them. If they're sensitive to being criticized or judged, they're using dark humor, especially during inappropriate times, or if they're struggling to make eye contact with you. This is when you can either ask the hard questions and check in on them, or even seek out professional help. So taking care of yourself and others during grief. So self-care is extremely important for us, and as well as our loved ones. And whether we're grieving or we're taking care of someone who's grieving, we really need to be supportive and supportive towards our loved one. So social connection is still very, very important. So such as phone calls or video chats or text messages, social media, continuing to maintain friendships, and checking in on our friends, families, especially the ones that are our older adults. And the older adults in our life might be even struggling and we're not aware of it. So making sure that you can even, whether they don't know how to use social media, you can send them a card or puzzles or stitches, or stitching things or coloring books, anything in general, like just sending them like something to let them know you're thinking about them because they might be struggling. And then on top of that, move. That's one main thing. That's something we could do still while we're at home, keeping in mind that we are currently going through the guidelines of stay-at-home order. You can move around, you can go for walks, get some fresh air. Sunlight is extremely helpful. Digging in the dirt, in the sense of really grounding with the earth and making sure that you are connecting yourself and being outside. If you're going to listen to music, please be mindful of the music that you're listening to. Keep in mind that if you are listening to music that is matching your mood, that is not always the best way. So for example, if you're depressed, not listening to blues, and if you're angry, not listening to Eminem, unless that's the best way for you to get through it. Making sure that you are trying to pick things that are more pick-me-up and help you really experience a more positive experience and bring up your mood. And then talking, making sure you're talking to others. Talk about your loved one if that's what you want to do, and allowing someone to talk about their loved one and asking them about them if that's something that they're interested in. Journaling, especially a gratitude journal, is extremely helpful, especially if you're having a hard time sleeping. Doing a gratitude journal at night or in the morning when you wake up. Ceremonies, so making sure that you are doing those ceremonial things to celebrate. So since we are at home, we can create a challenge on social media to have everybody light a candle for a loved one, or even sending out bags of forget-me-not seeds to remember or recognize that loved one as well. And then making sure that we're taking time off. That means whether it's work or social media, if we need it. So if it's something that you're having a hard time being on social media, disconnecting from that and turning that off and making sure that you do take time to take care of yourself. Make sure that you're realistic and gentle with yourself as well as with your loved one. And then if anything, making sure that you are seeking out that professional support that you might need. So remember, grief is difficult, but it's natural and it does serve a purpose. And it can make us turn inward and adjust to a new way of life without the people that we love, or even places or things that we've lost. So research has suggested that once a crisis has passed, people are able to bounce back and move forward. And that's in general. And a lot of times it's really hard and it does take time. So know that while we're grieving, it's okay to fluctuate, like I said before, between whether it's moments of being sad and mourning and moments of accepting what's happened, as well as even happiness. We are still allowed to have other emotions. That does not mean that our pain has gone away, but it is okay. And remembering that the pain doesn't last forever, but it does shift and it changes with us. And so no matter how bad your heart is broken, the world doesn't stop for your grief. So like I discussed, we are limited on the time that we could take off work or working through that pain that we're going through. But remember that there are others there to support you as well. So I just wanted to briefly go over some resources. For parents after the loss of a child, there is the compassionatefriends.org. With regards to books and resources, there is yourpaththroughgrief.com. And then we still do have Riverside County Helpline, and we have the Suicide Prevention Hotline. as well as seeking out your medical or mental health provider. And we do have Care Solace in place, which gives referrals for mental health providers, and that's for our USD families. There are social service resources for the Riverside County, which is 211. And then if you are having a hard time, there's a hotline that you can text if you're not a talker, and that is the 741-741 number. All you have to do is text hi. It can be at any hour or any time. And they do provide crisis counselors to support you. And then we do have the APA pandemic resource guide as well. So lastly, thank you. I did want to make sure that I put my email out there just in case anybody would like to reach out for questions. So for right now, we'll hang tight for a couple minutes and then we'll be closing out the webinar. All right, if there's no questions, we'll go ahead and close out. So thank you so much for attending.